This week's programme is devoted to one of the most easy to please and obliging plant groups that we have in the garden, the bulbs. Bung them in now, and I always think they're a bit like fireworks. They come up when you just stand well back.
You know, at the moment I feel like I've got 4 gardens. I've got my own at home. I seem to be here almost every week. I've been doing Bourneville all year, and I've also been working on another garden. This is my Sleeping Beauty garden because a year ago there was nothing here but bare soil. I planted it entirely with bulbs, tubers, corms and rhizomes, and they've repaid me by flowering non-stop and providing colour right from the beginning of the season in January until now. And this week on Gardener's World we'll be paying homage to the humble bulb. This sort of garden does take some planning, and the best time to start thinking about next year's display is now, in the autumn. So we thought we'd give you a little bit of inspiration, and to show you how you can achieve this sort of display, we have to go back to last October. There's a bulb for every part of the garden, from the simple daffodil to the exotic canna. Every season, bulbs can provide spectacular colour, scent, and sometimes just sheer flamboyance. Bulbs are the sleeping beauties of the horticultural world. It may not look like much, but stored in here is enough nourishment to support the first season's flowers. All that's needed to wake it up is not a kiss, but water. Well, bulb is often a term that's used to cover not just true bulbs like this narcissus, but corms, tubers and rhizomes as well. They're all simply methods of storing food through the dormant season underground so that it can come back into life the following season. Early spring bulbs flower from February to April and need to be planted in the autumn. At this time the soil is still warm, so the bulbs can establish a good root system before the ground freezes. I'm creating my planting scheme from scratch because I've got a lovely empty plot to play with. But of course you can fit yours in with your existing planting scheme. Now bulbs don't need fertilising in their first year of blooming, but this soil, which is in really good heart, doesn't need that anyway. What you do have to check is the drainage, because bulbs hate sitting in really heavy, wet soil. They'll just simply rot away. So I'm adding lots of horticultural grit. Well, here on the sunny side of the garden, I'm going to be putting some of the taller narcissi, things like Cheerfulness and St. Patrick's Day. And in front of those, I'll probably put something that's a little bit lower growing, like Thalia, and then at the very front, things like Tete-a-Tete and Jetfire, the really pretty small narcissi. And daffodils are really good examples of tunicated bulbs. And if I cut this one in half, you'll be able to see in the middle there's the dormant bud, and then these immature leaves which are overlapping around it, and then there are dried leaves on the outer edge which provide a protective layer. That's the tunic, if you like, hence tunicated bulb. Now, to set off the narcissi and give me a carpet of blue and white flowers and some ferny foliage, I want to put in some anemone blanda, the windflower. Now, these hate to dry out, so they've been soaking overnight in some water. There. Doesn't look like a bulb, does it? This is a tuber, which is a swollen root, and that acts as a food storage system. And they spread out pretty quickly, so if I plant this one, hopefully I'll end up with a small colony. Cyclamen have tuberous stems, but in my own bitter experience, if you plant them dried, you can have a pretty high failure rate. So I much prefer to buy them in the green, like this, as little plants, and then pop them straight in, and they just do much better. Now the cyclamen will also do really well here on this side, which is much shadier. And I've put them in with some erythroniums, which are the dog's tooth violets, and they're beautiful. And also some anemone nemorosa, which are rhizomes. And they've got these very strange little twiggy looking things, which are actually thickened stems. And again, they sort of hold nutrition in those swollen stems, and they spread horizontally just below the surface. So I'll put them in a minute, but first of all I'm going to put the narcissi in. And as a general rule of thumb, you want to plant the bulb about 3 times its own depth. So if it measures about 5 centimetres, you need twice that again on top. So you need to dig a hole 15 centimetres deep. Simple. In this country, we tend to be a bit restrained in our bulb planting. We just put in the odd clump of daffs here and there, and we forget just how much we need cheering up after a long, cold winter. But in Holland, they really know how to display their hyacinths and tulips. Every spring, the bulb growing district is host to the biggest flower parade, or Corso, in the country. And it's the job of Piet Gomans to make sure that this floral festival is quite literally traffic stopping.
What we see here is the flower parade of the bulb district, and we're working on the last 2 days actually to finish the job. This coming Saturday we got a big show outside. We cut these flowers because the bulb grows faster when there's no flower on it anymore. You can imagine the food which the bulb takes out of the air and the rain and stuff and out of the ground needs to go to the flower and the leaves. And we want the bulb to grow because we're bulb growers, so we don't want the flower to develop actually. So we take it up in the early stage already. So all the food what is in the plant is going to the bulb then, so it can grow. The flowers need to be taken off the fields, and there was just trash. And then they said, well, we can do something nice with it. We can, well, go to our public and say, okay, well, this is something else you can do with flower bulbs, and just to make people know that flower bulbs are a good thing. And so that's how they started out with a few floats, just to show the people what it was. And well, here we are 55 years later, still making flower parades. We got about 19 big floats covered with flowers, and we got a lot of, as you can see, a lot of people working here on free base actually. They all do it as a hobby, and you know, well, most people been here till very late last night and probably will be here till tomorrow morning 5 o'clock before they go home. It's hard to say exactly how many flowers we need, but it comes close to well, 2.5 million flowers, I guess.
I've been doing this since I was about 12 years or 10 years, yeah. I normally study, and I do the aerospace engineering study in Delft. So that's very different from this.
We try to win each year. We have a good thing that we pick our own flowers, so we have fresh flowers. It's a lot of work, but we need a lot of people, a lot of volunteers to work with us and to get it done.
People have one passion, and yeah, that's what they do it for, and not because of the competition. It's just being friendly, and it's really nice. The competition is nice.
In normal life, I have a own flower bulb export company actually. Most people, I guess, working in our organization are related to the flower bulb business some way. My father used to be the chairman of the flower parade, and I guess as long as I can remember, so probably that will be about 25 years that I can remember something, I'm in the flower parade. And it's like a disease actually. Once it gets you, it won't get you loose. Tomorrow afternoon around 12 o'clock everybody should be finished officially, then the jury is going around, and then Saturday the parade is going through the cities. The parade is running from Noordwijk. That's where we start early in the morning, and we go to Haarlem, and we arrive somewhere around 9 o'clock in the evening in Haarlem. So that's almost a 12-hour drive, and with a lot of fun, a lot of music, a lot of show, and it really is a big festival actually.
It was a really close finish, but we won this time again, so I'm really pleased with it. You see the result yourself. There's been a lot of work, but it has been worth it.
Well, it's May and spring has finally arrived in our own garden. And it may not be on quite the same scale as Holland, but there's still a definite atmosphere of cheerfulness in this garden. And that's exactly what this variety of narcissus is called, cheerfulness. And it's got wonderful late spring colour, a double flower, and it's also very slightly scented. Right next door is Thalia, which has lovely, brilliant white flowers, and those slightly reflex petals give just a hint at a cyclaminius parentage. And over here is Minnow, with up to 4 tiny flowers on each stem. And to me, that's the very essence of spring, particularly with the blue of the Corydalis. This planting scheme has been providing us with colour from the end of the winter with some of the early flowering crocuses and reticulata irises. But it also means that some of these earlier daffodils have gone over and they need deadheading. And that's really important because otherwise they'll put all their energy into producing seed. And you can see the seed head here just bulging with seeds, and if you split it open, there they are beginning to grow. So simply snap them off behind the seed head at the top of the neck. It's also really important to leave all the foliage on. When you first put a bulb in the ground, it's got all the food it needs for that first year within it. But this year, it needs to make more food for next year's flowers. And it does that by photosynthesizing and transforming the energy of the sun into food. So don't tie them down and don't cut them off. And you can also give it just a dusting of general purpose fertilizer as an extra boost. Some of the tulips, though, are only just starting, and they add real intensity of colour and glamour to the spring garden. Tulips originated in Persia, which is parts of modern-day Turkey and Iran. In the 1500s, they were the most popular plant of the day, and they were widely featured in the decoration of local textiles and pottery. These tulips went in November, a little later than most spring flowering bulbs, to help prevent tulip fire, a fungus that thrives in warm soil conditions. Tulips are among the most popular of the bulb groups, and there are literally hundreds of them to choose from. But I find that their foliage looks really scrappy when it's left in the ground after flowering, so I'm going to plant all of mine in these aquatic baskets. Now I'm just mixing some compost up to put them in, and it's a 50-50 mixture of John Innes No. 2 and a multi-purpose compost and plenty of horticultural grit. Just mix that through. Now I'm going to put another good layer of grit into the bottom of the basket. There we are. And a finished layer of compost. Now for the tulips. Which one should we go for? Okay, this one is Tulip Negrita. Now that's the same general rule of thumb when you come to planting. It goes in 3 times its own depth. But make sure that they're not actually touching. The other thing is that if you're planting them directly into the ground, I would put them in a little bit deeper because tulips repeat flower slightly better when they're put in lower down. Okay, compost on the top. There we are. Doesn't have to be too neat because I'm going to bury it. Okay. And then you just cover it over. For my colour palette for late spring, I've chosen Angelique, Spring Green, Blue Parrot, White Triumphata, Ballad and Queen of the Night. Tulips come in a huge range of colours, but my colour palette was themed on the dramatic skies of spring. Sandra and Norrie Pope have their own philosophy on colour and know how to team up their tulips with the herbaceous plants in their walled garden at Hadsburn House in Somerset.
We were travelling in England, looking at gardens, going from garden to garden, and we came here and it was a beautiful autumn day and everything seemed wonderfully romantic about it. So we thought, yes, we could make a garden here. Wouldn't it be wonderful?
When we saw this walled garden, we thought you could do so much here, and particularly the shape of this walled garden, which is a D shape. The design really lent itself to the way we like to use colour, which is monochrome planting, and particularly in that curve, we felt that we could go through all the colours in the spectrum.
Kind of develop, when you say monochrome, we mean sort of starting with a single colour, developing through that in a very similar way you would to a piece of music, starting with a simple chord and working through that to more complexity.
There isn't really a language for describing and defining gardens. I mean, there's of course the botanical and the horticultural language. We tend to draw on music for the language, using sort of the harmonies and the melodies and the crescendos, and I think it's a very appropriate language for gardening.
The deep maroons and dark blacky greys and all the wonderful texture to the flowers. Right now, the Queen of the Night tulip and the dark foliage. It's like a deep notes on a cello, that it's very, it's thoughtful and kind of a bit mournful, but wonderfully so. I think that's what I like best. Always a garden shows the personality of the person that planted it. You can't help it. It's the same way as a painting or a piece of music would. That whether you want it to or not, it's your personality. So my border's always probably messier.
The concepts of how men and women see colour and distance is very true. And when I'm having to think about a distant view or the depth of a border or, you know, how big something's going to be when it matures, I always turn to Norrie for those sorts of things. And when we're thinking about colour or the certain tones or whether that flower colour works with that stem colour or that leaf colour.
Yeah, I'll always turn to you.
Yeah, exactly.
When planting tulips in the autumn, of course, it's 6 months since you've seen a tulip, so I'll rely on Sandra's memory of the colour. For instance, pink. I'll remember it's pink. She'll remember exactly the tonality and the hue, what it will fit with and what will work with it.
Isn't the orange of this lily-flowered tulip ballerina fantastic? It's just glowing and it's so beautiful. I love it particularly teamed with this Euphorbia griffithii, because just as Griffithii is coming into flower with that sort of bright orange, it just picks up that deep back of the ballerina.
In the yellow border here, I stay very tight to the harmonies. The yellow, the West Point tulip is actually quite fun. They quite mimic the flower of Euphorbia polychroma. So we always plant them tight in beside them. Each season we usually get at least one person that will come in and say, I want the Euphorbia with their big flowers.
The color range of tulips is amazing. Any plant that offers us such a range of color is invaluable, and tulips are just ideal for that.
Tulips at this time of year really turn up the volume of the color volume, if you like. That they really start everything cracking. It's been sweet until now.
When the first ones come out, just seeing that big piece of color is just really exciting after a long winter.
Returning to my bulb garden in late May, the tulips have finished flowering. Unlike daffodils, the quality of tulip blooms tends to diminish year after year. If you decide to give them a second year, make sure you don't cut off the foliage as you do with the narcissi. But the beauty of it is that you can also treat them as bedding, and because we planted these in baskets, I can just lift them out and replace them with something else. This is the perfect time to start thinking about summer colour. So it's good to get in bulbs, tubers of summer flowering bulbs to replace those that you've taken out. Top of the list has got to be cannas and dahlias, which both need similar treatment. Earlier this year, I started off with one single dahlia tuber, but I wanted 3 plants, so I started it off in a greenhouse, took some cuttings from it, and I've got young plants now which are just about ready to go out. So I'm going to just dig some new holes for them, not very deep. Of course, these are not hardy and will have to be lifted once the first frosts have blackened the leaves. This dahlia is called Summer Night, which is appropriate because it's a beautiful, very intense, dark, rich crimson. In these decorative containers, I want really strong structural planting, so I'm relying quite heavily on plants from South Africa. And this is Eucomis, which hails from the Eastern Cape. It's dormant during the dry winters and it comes into flower during the rainy season in the summer. So it's not frost hardy and would have to come in over winter. And they produce wonderful glossy strap-like foliage, and the flowers are topped with a little tufty bract which makes them look a bit like a pineapple, hence their common name, which is pineapple lily. But I prefer the origin of the Latin name Eucomis, which means beautiful hair. Another South African bulb you can plant in May for late summer colour is Crocosmia. And in a tiny garden in Plymouth, David Fennick divides his time between caring for his wife Colleen and looking after a national collection of Crocosmia.
It all started about 8 years ago when I started to landscape the garden shortly after Colleen and I got married. I took her to the garden house at Buckler Monacorum to see what flowers she liked, and she saw the Crocosmia and said, oh, I must have a few of those. So I decided to collect a few more than just a few, because it was something that we could share, like we share everything else in our marriage. It was just sort of heaven sent, really. We collected about 100 hybrids in just 18 months. And it was from then, really, that we applied for the National Collection of Crocosmia. And now we grow about 160 different varieties of Crocosmia on the garden. We don't measure the garden in yards. We don't measure it in feet. We measure the garden in inches. It's so small. But bulbs are very versatile. You can get bulbs from 1/4 of an inch diameter up to nearly 1 foot in diameter. So you can plant bulbs, different types of bulbs, one on top of the other that flower at different periods of the year. So you can amass thousands of bulbs in a very small area, and that's what gives us the colour what we have here. Crocosmia are a genus of 8 species from southern Africa. Here we've got Crocosmia pottsii, which was one of the first ones introduced into the UK in 1880, and it's also one of the parents of Crocosmia flora, the common Montbretia. Prometheus is a charming orange with a red ring in the throat, very nicely marked Crocosmia, a change from the usual self-coloured forms of orange-yellow, and adds interest in any garden. Crocosmia became fashionable in 1966 with the breeding of Crocosmia lucifer by Alan Bloom of Blooms of Bressingham. Bressingham went on to produce numerous hybrids such as Spitfire, Jenny Bloom and Ember Glow, and it was really those hybrids that encouraged other breeders to produce more and more Crocosmia. Hybrids such as Zeal Giant, which is one of the tallest Crocosmia that's ever been bred. In good garden soil it actually reached about 7 feet high. We try and conserve what breeders have bred over the past 150 years. So we conserve their legacy as sort of a living museum. other South African bulbs, like Torbegia, like Eucomis, we can serve them for different reasons. Because in the habitats where they come from, in South and Southern Africa, many of them are presently being dug up and used medicinally. We aim to try and grow a very wide selection of various types of bulbs that may well be under threat or endangered in the wild. All of this has been done on a shoestring budget, but we've been very fortunate to have had the help of many fellow gardeners, and a lot of them have sent us plants, and we've exchanged and swapped plants and bulbs, seeds from many different people from around the UK and from around Europe as well. And so really the garden's dedicated to them, but it's also something that anybody can achieve, and in a short space of time as well.
And if that didn't inspire you, then this should. It's now October, a full year since that first planting, and the garden is looking absolutely fantastic. The summer flowering bulbs that I planted back in the spring have now taken over from the late spring flowers which have faded. And you cannot beat dahlias for a flash of late summer colour. It's not only the hot colour of the flowers, but it's the contrasting foliage too. And they really make this garden come alive at a time when other gardens are already beginning to go over. This lot came into flower towards the end of August, and they'll keep looking good until the first frosts begin to blacken the leaves. What they do love is lots of moisture and plenty of food, so if you want to get flowering like this, it's a good idea to give them a liquid feed once a week. Now the other thing is, to keep them flowering, you need to keep deadheading, and that means not just taking them off behind the flower, but following the stalk right down to where you get a good strong pair of buds. Now one of my favourites is David Howard, which has got this wonderful orangey tangerine coloured flower. And it's not just the flowers, but the plant itself has a really compact shape. It's really strong growing stems up to about 4 foot. And these lovely bronze leaves give a really good contrast to the flowers. But that's not the best foliage colour. Just look at Yellowhammer. Now this is so intense it's almost black, and it really shows off that golden yellow single flower. Absolutely beautiful. I'm really pleased with these cannas because they add a tropical touch to the garden, and it's not just the flowers but these banana-like leaves which come out much earlier back in May. The hot colours work really well with the rest of the garden, and at 5 feet tall they add some much needed extra height. Like the dahlias, the cannas are really greedy, so they need similar treatment, lots of moisture and lots of feeding. And also like dahlias, they're not hardy, so you need to lift them over the winter. And you do that when the first really severe frost has blackened the stems and the leaves. Just chop them down, dig them up, and then store them in a tray of compost just underneath the surface, and keep them very slightly watered just to stop them from drying out. A whole year after the garden was started, and I can smell autumn in the air, and I can see the cyclamen hydrifolium that we planted last year. So we've come full circle, and it's bulb planting time again. There's always space for a bulb, a rhizome, a corm or a tuber. So if you want to be cheered up in the spring, knocked out by fragrance in the summer, and blasted with colour in the autumn, get planting. For a list of all the bulbs planted in the Sleeping Beauty garden, visit our website on www.bbc.co.uk/gardening.